Let me describe a moment you may recognize. You're in an interview, it's going reasonably well, you're answering questions, making eye contact, doing the thing, and then the interviewer, who looks like she might have been in middle school when you were closing your first major deal, says something like, "We're really looking for someone who can grow with the company long term." And you smile and nod, and inside you do the math. Or maybe it wasn't an interview. Maybe it was a reorg. And you looked around at who got kept and who got walked, and you noticed a pattern. Or it was a performance review where suddenly your experience started getting mentioned in a tone that it made it sound like a pre existing condition. You suspect ageism. And here's the thing, you might be right. Age discrimination is real, it's pervasive. It's also frustratingly very hard to prove, very hard to address directly. And this is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Sometimes what feels like ageism or something else entirely is actually something else entirely. And conflating the two makes it harder to respond effectively to either one. So today, that's what we're getting into. I'm Rich Jones. This is Live Without an Expiration Date, the show for professionals in the second half of their careers who are navigating disruption, relevance, and reinvention without being told to lean in or embrace the pivot. I've been in financial services for about 25 years. I've been a fractional executive, an independent consultant for a meaningful chunk of that. And I am, and I'll say it, not 20, not 35. I have a grandson named Oscar. I was in the Marine Corps during a period that my children find historically interesting. My first experience with a mobile phone involved an antenna that could double as a weapon. I know the territory. So let's talk about it. First, let's get clear on what we're actually talking about. Age discrimination, legally speaking, in the United States, is covered under the Age Discrimination of Employment Act of 1967, which protects workers 40 and older from discriminating based upon age. So if you're listening to this show, you are very likely covered. But the law and lived experience are two different conversations. Because in practice, age discrimination almost never shows up as someone saying, "We're not hiring you because you're too old." That would be insane. Nobody does that. What it looks like instead is a collection of signals, some subtle, some not. So here's what to watch for: the language signals. When job postings or interviewers use terms like high energy, digital native, fresh perspective, scrappy, or grow with the company, these aren't automatically discriminatory, but they're worth noticing. Digital native is particularly interesting because it literally means someone who grew up using technology, which is just a polite way of describing someone young. If a job posting requires you to be a digital native and you were born before 1995, that's a tell. The trajectory of the interview. There's a difference between an interviewer who's assessing your capabilities and one who seems to already be looking for confirmation of of a conclusion they've reached. When the questions cluster around adaptability, learning new things, keeping up with change, not because those things are actually relevant to the role, but because they seem to be on a checklist, that's a signal. The overqualified label. This one deserves its own conversation because overqualified is one of the great euphemisms of modern hiring. What it usually means is one of three things: you're too expensive, you'll leave when something better comes along, or and this is the one we're dancing around, you're too old and we're trying to be polite about it. Sometimes it means all three simultaneously, which I've got to admit is impressive in its own way. The pattern of outcomes. This is the one that's hardest to dismiss. When you look across a period of time, job applications, internal opportunities, project assignments, client relationships, and you notice a consistent pattern where you're not advancing and younger colleagues are, that's data. It's not conclusive, but it's data. The cultural signals. Team lunches you're not invited to, conversations that stop when you walk in, the casual references to things that assume everyone in the room was born after 1985. These are softer, but they accumulate. Now, here's the important caveat. And I want to be direct about this because I think it's underserved in most conversations about ageism. Not every rejection is ageism. Not every passed over opportunity is ageism. Not every uncomfortable interview question is ageism. Sometimes you weren't the right fit. Sometimes someone else was genuinely better suited for that particular role. Sometimes your skills actually do have gaps that need addressing, and age isn't the variable. The reason I'm saying this isn't to minimize discrimination, which is real and damaging. It's because conflating the two creates a strategic problem. If you attribute every setback to ageism, you stop asking the harder questions about what you can actually control. And you need to be asking those questions. The most useful frame I've found in this is this: assume both things might be true simultaneously. Ageism may be a factor, and there may also be things you can work on. Neither cancels the other out. Emotional reality, let's not skip this part. Before we get into strategy, because we're going to get into strategy, I want to spend a few minutes on the emotional reality of this because I think it gets glossed over. Suspected ageism is a specific kind of experience. It's different from other forms of professional rejection because it's not because something you did or didn't do. It's about who you are, and more specifically, how long you've been who you are. There's an anger component. You spent decades building expertise, relationships, judgment, and perspective, things that take years to develop and can't be faked. And you're watching someone with a fraction of your experience get opportunities you're being quietly steered away from. That's legitimately infuriating. The anger is appropriate. There's also a self-doubt component. And this is the sneaky one, because even when you actually know intellectually that discrimination is the issue, the experience of repeated rejections still plants seeds. Am I actually out of touch? Have I stopped growing? Is there something about me that I'm not seeing clearly? These questions aren't unreasonable. Some of them are worth sitting with, but they also spiral in ways that aren't useful. And then there's the grief component. And I say grief deliberately because I think that's what it is. There's a version of your career, a set of expectations about how things were supposed to go and what your experience was supposed to be worth. And when you hit a wall that's not about your performance, there's a loss involved. That deserves to be named. I'm not going to tell you to reframe it as an opportunity right now. That's for later. Right now, I'm just acknowledging that this is hard. It's real. The emotional response to it is normal. What I will say is this: the professionals I've seen navigate this most effectively are not the ones who suppress the emotional response. They're the ones who feel it, process it, and then deliberately choose what to do next. The key word is deliberately, not reactively, not from a place of resentment or resignation, deliberately. That's the work. Let's talk about how to do it. What you cannot control and why being clear on that matters. I spent a lot of time in my career, more than I should have, expending energy on things I couldn't control. And I want to save you some of that time. Here's what you cannot control. You cannot control another people's bias. Age bias, like most bias, is often unconscious. The hiring manager who just didn't feel a connection may not even be aware that what they're registering is discomfort with a candidate who's 20 years older than the rest of the team. You cannot reach into someone's unconscious assumptions and rearrange them. That's not a tool you have. You cannot control organizational culture that's already set. If a company has decided, consciously or not, that it's building a certain kind of team with a certain kind of demographic profile, you're not going to walk into that interview and change institutional momentum with a particularly compelling answer to, tell me about yourself. You're not that powerful. Neither am I. No one is. You cannot control the legal process in a way that makes it practically useful for most situations. Yes, age discrimination is illegal. Yes, the EEOC exists. Yes, in some cases, legal action is warranted and worth pursuing. But the practical reality is that proving age discrimination is extraordinarily difficult. The process is long, the emotional and financial cost is significant, and most people, most of the time, are better served by redirecting that energy elsewhere. That's a pragmatic statement, not a moral one. Here's why being clear on what you want, on what you can't control matters. It stops you from spending energy in the wrong places. Every hour you spend strategizing about how to change a biased interviewer's mind is an hour you didn't spend finding an environment where your experience is actually valued. The goal is not to win over every room. The goal is to find the right rooms. The distinction is actually important and is one that took me longer than I'd like to admit to internalize fully. What you can control, and this is the real conversation. All right, here's where we spend most of our time because it's where the actual leverage is. One, your narrative. The single most powerful thing you control is how you tell your story. There's a version of your story that sounds like a history lesson, chronological, comprehensive. I started in banking in 1998, and then I moved to X, and then Y, and then had some real success doing Z. And by the time you get to the present, the person across the table has quietly concluded that your best years are behind you. There's another version of your story that leads with relevance. What problems do you solve? Who do you solve them for? What have you seen that most people in this conversation haven't? What mistakes have you already made so you know which ones not to make that someone 20 years younger hasn't had a chance to make yet? That's not spin. That's accurate. Experience has actual value. The question is whether you're communicating that value in a way that lands or whether you're communicating it in a way that inadvertently confirms the bias you're trying to overcome. Here's a reframe. I found useful. Stop positioning your years of experience as an asset and start positioning your judgment as an asset. Years of experience is a quantity. Judgment is a quality. Judgment is what you've built with those years. That's a different conversation. And on a related note, stop apologizing for your experience. I have heard so many professionals in their 50s and 60s soft pedal their own backgrounds in an attempt not to seem threatening or overqualified or old. It doesn't work. What it does is make you seem uncertain about your own value, which is a different and worse problem. Own what you built. Present it as relevant to the specific context you're in. Don't recite it, translate it. Number two, your presence, digital and physical. Let's be honest about something. Some of what gets attributed to ageism is actually a presence problem. Not always, not even usually, but sometimes. Your LinkedIn profile, when was it last updated? Does it read like a resume from 2012? Is your photo from an era when that hairstyle made more sense? I'm not making fun. I'm describing things I've seen, including at various points on my own profile. Your LinkedIn presence matters, not because you need to perform being young. You don't, and you shouldn't, but because a neglected, outdated, or sparse digital presence sends a signal. The signal it sends is this person isn't active in their professional world. That's not an age signal, it's a relevant signal, but it gets conflated. Update your profile, use a current photo, write a summary that sounds like you today, not you 15 years ago. Engage with content in your field, post things, have opinions publicly. Similarly, and I know this is the part where some of you are going to internally roll your eyes, you should be visible in conversations about things that are changing in your field. AI, data, digital transformation, whatever the current set of accelerating changes look like in your industry, not because you need to pretend to be something you're not, but because being literate in those conversations, actually literate, not performing literacy, changes how you're perceived. Soon, I'm teaching a class to a group of credit union marketers at a marketing certification school on AI and data strategy. Not because I'm a technology person, because I took the time to actually understand what these tools do, how they're being used, and what they mean for the organizations I serve. That's a choice. It's available to everyone. Three, your target environment. This one is underrated. Not every organization is equally biased towards youth. Some genuinely value experience, and the organizations that value experience aren't always the most obvious ones. They're not all legacy companies or slow moving companies. Some of the most dynamic organizations understand that a team of people who never made mistakes as a team that's about to make expensive ones. Your job, part of your job, is to qualify the environments you're pursuing with the same rigor you would qualify a sales prospect, because that's what it is. You are identifying environments where the fit is real, not just a job posting. Questions worth asking directly in interviews are, how does this organization think about experience as it relates to innovation? Or how can you tell me about the tenure range on your team? Or how does leadership view mentorship relationships across experience levels? These aren't trick questions. They're legitimate questions about organizational culture. And the answers, not just the words, but how they're delivered, who gets uncomfortable, and what's deflected, tell you a lot. You're not trying to get every job. You're trying to find the right position in the right organizations. That frame changes your strategy significantly. Number four, your network. who you're connected to, and how. Here's the uncomfortable truth about job searching in your 50s or 60s. If you are primarily depending on applying to job postings, you are playing a game that is statistically stacked against you. Hiring through applications is where bias has the most room to operate. You're going up against resume screening software that may not favor your graduation year. Hiring managers who see your 30 years of experience and do the math they shouldn't be doing, and process designed by people who are, in many cases, significantly younger than you. Where you have an advantage is relationships, people who you know, people who've seen you work, people who can say, I worked with Rich. He's the person you want for this. This is the competitive edge. The older you get, professionally speaking, the more of those relationships you should have. The question is whether you're cultivating them, maintaining them, and activating them strategically. The ask you need to be comfortable making is not, do you have a job for me? It's, who should I be talking to? It's, I'm exploring opportunities in X. Does anyone in your world come to mind? It's lateral, it's warm and specific, not a cold blast to everyone you've ever met. If you've let your network atrophy, and most people do when they're busy, this is the time to rebuild it. Not in a desperate transactional way, in an honest, genuine, I'm actively looking for the next chapter, and I'd value your perspective. Your flexibility and being honest about it is number 5. The traditional employment model, full-time, permanent, one employer, career ladder, is not the only model available to you. And it's worth being honest about whether that model is actually the best path for where you are. Fractional work, contract roles, consulting engagements, interim leadership, project-based work, these are not consolation prizes. For some professionals, they are a better fit than any permanent role. More flexibility, more variety, more control over where you direct your expertise, and in many cases, compensation that compares favorably once you do the math. I'm not suggesting you abandon the pursuit of a full-time role if that's what you want. I'm suggesting that limiting yourself exclusively to that model in a market where your age is a headwind in a traditional hiring process is a strategic choice that's worth examining. Things that don't help, let's name them. I've talked about what helps. Let me spend a few minutes on what doesn't. Performing youth. There is a particular flavor of professional self-presentation that I can only describe as desperate, and it is more visible to everyone else than it is to the person doing it. Overusing acronyms you just learned last week, dropping references to platforms and tools in ways that don't quite land, being being suspiciously enthusiastic about the metaverse. People can tell. And it doesn't help because it's not addressing the actual concern, which is whether your judgment is current and your skills are relevant. It's addressing a surface symptom in a way that highlights the gap rather than closing it. You don't need to perform being young. You need to demonstrate being current. Those are different. Relitigating the past. That's a big mistake. In my day, we used to is a phrase with a very specific effect on a room, and that effect is not what you want. Same with the extended reminiscence about how things worked before certain technologies existed, or how much better the old way was. Even if you're right, even if the old way was genuinely better, you are not reinforcing exactly the perception you're trying to overcome. Reference your history when it demonstrates relevant insight, not because it's history. Excessive modesty. I mentioned this earlier, but it deserves its own entry. When you qualify everything you say with, I don't know if this is still how things work, or I may be out of touch on this, but, or you are not being, or something like that, you are not being appropriately humble. You are undermining your own credibility. There's a difference between genuine intellectual humility. Here's what I've seen. I'd be curious on how that maps to your current experience, and reflexive self-deprecation that signals insecurity. You're allowed to have you're allowed to have knowledge. You are allowed to trust your experience. You are allowed to state things without apologizing for the fact that you've been around a long enough time to know them. Bitterness. This is one that's most understandable and most damaging. When the resentment about age discrimination starts leaking into how you show up in interviews, in professional conversations, in your general posture toward the world, it reads. People can feel it. And however justified it is, bitterness makes you less hireable, less referable, and less effective. Not because the bitterness is wrong, but because it crowds out the things that make you effective. Process anger somewhere, private. Show up everywhere else as someone who's genuinely engaged with what's in front of them. The longer view, what this moment is actually about. Here's something I want to offer as a different frame on this whole conversation. Facing the reality of age in the job market, the bias, the headwinds, the narrowing of certain doors is uncomfortable. It's genuinely hard. I'm not going to package it as anything else. But also, I think there's something in it that, if you're willing to look at it directly, is clarifying in a way that nothing else quite is. When certain doors close, or when you start to feel the friction of keeping them open, it forces a question. And the question is not just, how do I stay in the game? It's, which game do I actually want to be playing? I've talked to a lot of professionals in their 50s and 60s who are fighting hard to stay in a lane that, if they're honest with themselves, they weren't sure they wanted to be in anymore. The fight to prove they're still relevant in a particular kind of organization, to a particular kind of employer, in a particular kind of role. And if they actually got it, they'd be doing something they've outgrown in a culture that doesn't particularly value what they bring for a paycheck that isn't actually what's driving them. The resistance from the market sometimes has the side effect of forcing a more honest conversation with yourself about what you actually want from this chapter. That's not a silver lining speech. I'm not trying to repackage discrimination as a gift. It's not a gift. But I do think the disruption, when you're willing to look at it fully, has a clarifying effect that's worth something. The professionals I most respect in the second half of their careers are the ones who fought the hardest to hold on to the version of their career that made sense at 40. They're the ones who use the friction as information about themselves, about their values, about where they could actually do the most meaningful work, and made deliberate choices from there. You have more runway than the job market is telling you. You have more contribute than a hiring algorithm can assess. And you have the advantage, the actual concrete competitive advantage of having already navigated things that most people in the room are still going to have to experience. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Okay, let's do a practical summary, the short list. Let me bring this home with this short version because I know some of you are multitasking. No judgment. I'm a podcaster. I understand my audience. If you're facing suspected ageism, here's what to do. First, name it accurately. Ageism may be a factor. Other factors may also be in play. Both can be true. Don't collapse all setbacks into one narrative because it prevents you from responding effectively. Second, process the emotional reality. The anger is appropriate. The self doubt is understandable. The grief is real. Don't skip this part, but don't camp here either. Third, get clear on what you can't control. Other people's bias, organizational culture, the legal landscape. Stop spending energy there. Fourth, focus on what you can control, your narrative. Lead with judgment, not tenure. Your digital presence. Update it, activate it. Your target environment. Qualify organizations the way you'd qualify prospects. Your network. This is your competitive advantage. Activate it. Your model. Consider whether fractional contract or consulting work serves you better than what you've assumed. Fifth, avoid the traps. Don't perform youth. Don't relitigate the past. Don't undermine yourself with excessive modesty. Don't let the bitterness show. Maybe, just maybe, lose the comb over and the hair dye. You're not fooling anyone. Sixth, take the longer view. The friction is information. What does it tell you about what you actually want for your future? That's the work. None of it is easy. All of it is available to you. Well, that's the episode. If this one landed for you, if it describes something you're in the middle of, I'd genuinely like to know. You can reach me at rjones0747 at gmail.com or find me on LinkedIn. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. That's how this show finds people who need it. I'm Rich Jones. This is Live Without an Expiration Date, navigating career disruption, relevance, and reinvention in the second half of your working life. Take care of yourselves. I'll talk to you next time.